the regular standard like TV bleed.
I feel like that'd be good because it sounds funny when that happens.
Funny. It's funny. No, it literally is funnier than saying the actual cuss word because like, like the picture I showed you, I posted on your Facebook with the guy like ready, like about to be falling off his horse. He's like, oh. Like, oh.
Actually,
yeah, I agree.
That's actually interesting to me because I know that for my most of my adult life, the phrase that's been the most interesting to me is "fucking A." It's like, so I'm okay saying "fucking," but "ass" is a step too far.
Yeah, not in a Christian household, Nicholas.
I remember hearing on Clerks too. It's like, and they were talking about it was better Lord of the Rings or Star Wars. I was like, fucking A.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah, I remember that part.
And they're comparing like which trilogy was better, and it wasn't of the King, it's of the Jedi.
Just talking mad shit to each other.
So how's everyone surviving the apocalypse?
Honestly, hanging in there. I mean, let's just hope that it ends sooner rather than later.
Yeah, I'm definitely feeling the same way. For me, not going to like jiu-jitsu practice, not being able to interact with my students in person has been like some of the biggest bummers for this whole thing.
I mean, all I know is that there's 69-cent Big Gulps at the 7-Eleven next to where I live now. So that's positive.
There's a little bit of a silver lining.
But caffeine for less than $1.
Everyone's either going to come out of this with like a whole new set of skills or like 200 pounds heavier than when this thing started.
Right? Or just a really, really strong forearm.
Or one arm might be bigger than the other.
Yeah. One very strong forearm.
No, one arm bigger than the other, boys.
Yeah, I want this to be over. Obviously, yesterday was my birthday. Again, David, thank you for helping with that.
No problem.
In the meantime, there's plenty of history to be talked about, isn't there, boys?
Yep.
We're going to get medieval up in his house.
That's right.
Let's get this started. Welcome back to A Mouthful of History. I am Nicholas Malott. With me, as always, David Hollingsworth.
Hey, everyone. Hope you're doing okay out there.
And our hosts for today's episode, Cameron Millage. And I am going to turn it over to Cameron.
Let's get this party started.
Let's
do it.
All right, first things first. Big up all the Normans out there. Whoever's first name is Norman. Big up Norman. Bigger, better breakfast. $6.99, I think. Still, this is shameless advertising. Norms, if you ever hear this, we have a right to have that kind of breakfast for a deal. But you might ask yourself, why am I bigging up Norman? Anyone whose first name's Norman or restaurant Norms. Well, we're talking about the Normans today, ladies and gentlemen. So we're going to get medieval. So we're going back 1,000 years. So we talked about the presidential elections last time around. Well, make sure you get your time machines working. We are going back to the Middle Ages.
Mine's in the shop.
Those time machine mechanics, man, they always try to screw you over.
I mean, they put in the wrong setting. They go too forward in the future. You go too far back in the past. Get the setting absolutely right. So Nick, you also studied Norman history. What do you think the significance of the Normans are in this instance?
My study of the Normans really focused a lot on their effect on England. And I think that's, if anybody knows anything about the Normans, it generally stops and ends with, oh, they're the ones who conquered England. However, an interesting caveat I found on this, as you guys know, one of the major turning points of World War II was the invasion of Normandy by the Allies, commonly known as D-Day.
Yeah.
There's a gravesite in Normandy for the soldiers, and it's broken down by the nations. There is a British gravesite for the fallen British soldiers who helped invade Normandy. Over the gravesite, there's a Latin phrase on it, and it roughly translates into, we, once conquered by William, do liberate the conqueror's land. So that does tell you that the spirit or the importance of the Normans is a little bit bigger than most people realize, even 1,000 years later.
It is really interesting because it's such a foreign concept to us in the United States, because we don't have that like contiguous line of succession and history here in the US that they have in like Europe.
Well, we're a relatively new country. We've only been around as a nation since Revolutionary War. We haven't been on the world stage for that long, where countries like England and France have been around 1,000 years to the extent. So, of course, like to Nick's point, we hear 1066. We hear the Battle of Hastings. But the Norman influence extended beyond 1944. So let's get to it. So today we are going to talk about 3 things for this first episode. So we're going to talk about the Norman origins. We're going to talk about William the Bastard, who are also known as William the Conqueror. And third, we are going to be talking about Norman England post-Hastings. All right, so I want everyone to close their eyes and imagine you're on your time machine. You're stuck in a Norm's restaurant.
I like where this is going.
Well, really, you ask yourself, why am I in a Norm's? Well, it doesn't make sense. So, actually, we're going to go into around 800s Common Era. So, we're going to talk about the main man, Charlemagne. Not Charlemagne the God, Charlemagne.
My guy.
So, we got to talk about the Frankish kingdom first. Charlemagne unified the Frankish kingdom, and it was the biggest kingdom in Western Europe since the fall of the Roman Empire. He had 3 sons, but only one of them survived before his succession happened. That was Louis the Pious. So Louis the Pious takes over for Charlemagne when he dies. But the thing is, he has 3 sons. So he has Charles the Bald, Lothar, and Louis the German. All 3 of them do not die. So in Carolingian Frankish law, the dad's inheritance has to be split up amongst his sons. So they don't exercise primogeniture, which means everything's given to the firstborn. So really, what if your estate's an entire kingdom? When he died, it got split up in the Treaty of Verdun to West Francia, Middle Francia, which is absolutely bonkers of a territory, and you have East Francia. So what we know today is East Francia and West Francia. West Francia we now know as France. East Francia we know as Germany. But right as this split happened, the Vikings show up. Really, talk about pillaging, killing, blood. They were raiding all of Europe. Mostly the Viking invasions we know are most popular in England, with Lindisfarne and the Norwegians. But some Norwegians decided to roll down to the Seine River Valley in France and started really just murking on North France and as far up to Paris. There was this Norse chief by the name of Rollo, so not really of the name Rollos that you find at Target. Not really that good of a
sucks.
The Rollos suck, but this Rollo seems like pretty much like a badass. He is considered the bane of the existence of the Franks, or of West Francia. So his band of Norse Vikings are doing so much damage that King Charles III, or also known as Charles the Simple, decides to make a treaty with Rollo at Epte River. So in 911 CE, he meets with Rollo, and they sign the Treaty of Saint-Clair-sur-Epte, which means Saint Clair on the Epte River. So it's in the French way. I've been studying French for a little while now, so I'm really trying to get into really pronouncing the words properly.
All I know is omelette du fromage.
Oh man, fuck you, cheese.
Solid Dexter reference.
Thank you.
Solid Dexter reference. So here are the contents of the Treaty of Saint-Clair-sur-Epte. Charles the Simple gives Rollo parts of northern France as territory in exchange for protection from other Viking raiders. And that territory will be known as Normandy. Also, Rollo had to be baptized as a Christian to kind of show loyalty. But there was also a funny thing that happens. When the treaty was signed, Charles the Simple, in the ceremonial ritual, he put his foot up to Rollo. So it's the whole kissing of the feet, like showing loyalty to the king. But Rollo didn't want to do that because why am I going to kiss the foot of a king that I was really beaten all the time? So Rollo takes one of his assistants, has him kiss his foot, but then he takes the foot, like he puts it so high that Charles falls down. So that is in the primary sources. Did that actually happen? I don't know.
I hope it did.
Would you say that this is, I mean, we know that North France, Normandy, and the rest of France would have a contentious relationship for quite some time. Would you say this is basically the start of that kind of relationship?
Well, first we got to tell the audience why are they called the Normans. Well, the French called the Normans the Normans because of the direction in which they came from. Normans, the Northmen, men from the north. But there was a contentious relationship because they weren't really French. But here's the thing. What made the Normans like sustain their power was they assimilated. And they started to marry French women. They started to speak Frankish language, or we considered French, Norman French, and they all baptized the Christianity. So they started giving up all of their old traditions. There is a very contentious relationship there, but the Normans are doing what they can to be a part of it, so there's less friction. You catch my drift?
Yeah, that
Yeah,
makes
and
sense.
it's actually it's pretty interesting because for me, having studied world history a little bit more over the last couple of years, it's a really common pattern. Like, for example, when Islam as a religion and as a kingdom was coming up, the Arabs actually started adapting to Persian customs because while Arabs were used to expansion through conquest, they didn't have a tradition of like high culture and government and politics. And so they kind of did similar things. And like a bunch of other societies have too. So it's interesting that you kind of see that common thread among different conquering peoples to where they take some of the habits of the local people because those local people have that like administrative experience.
I mean, how many societies have copied the Persian way of governance? But that's totally for a different episode. But the Persian way of governance basically has hung on for so many years. Like the Greeks and Romans took it as well. Back to the Normans. That was their way of assimilating. So they also adopted feudalism. People working the land of a lord in exchange for military protection. You know, they had to give all their profits to the lords, and they kept some, food, some money, but they were tied to the land in which they worked. So it was a feudal system of governance, and also fiefdoms as well. So these fiefdoms were kind of land that were given to knights. So that was essentially how they started to adapt to continental European culture.
That makes sense.
It makes sense, but the thing is, they had to reconcile their past as well. And so they started making churches and cathedrals and chapels. So it was kind of like their religious insurance policy. So kind of saying like, we're sorry. And here are some places of worship for everybody.
Sorry for raiding and killing and doing all that other general pillaging stuff. But we're totally super serious now, guys. We're Christians. And all that stuff we did in the past, we're cool, right?
Yeah. Like spitting and like, we cool. And I mean, we know Mont Saint Michel. You've seen that. You've seen that. Oh, it's like one of the coolest. It has like a Minas Tirith vibe to it. I mean, we all started watching Lord of the Rings this week, so I had to throw that in there. But Mont Saint Michel kind of looks like Minas Tirith in a way. But they were known for their Roman-esque architecture, so they preserved much of Roman values in their architecture. They really wanted to use these places as sort of a religious insurance policy. As a result, kind of saying we're sorry for killing and pillaging, and they wanted to like make sure their path to heaven was secured. And so they adopted the social structures of France as well later on, and legal systems as well. This is the Viking group that sustained power the most, and there's plenty of content for many episodes on this. Assimilating into French culture and Frankish French society, that's how they stayed in power. And they also adopted castle building as well. The castles we see in Europe that are still standing, these are pretty cool castles, but they're also used for intimidation. These aren't supposed to be cool places. They're supposed to intimidate the local population. So, and also for lords and nobles to live. It's kind of like try to take over our castle,
Yeah. Also is a really good way of intimidating the locals. Like, hey, you want some protection when those raiders come into town? Well, where else are you going to go?
Yeah, and I mean, I think the final point on the assimilation of the Franks was that they drank wine, typifying Frenchness.
So did they drink like beer before more or something, or?
If they were northern raiders, then they probably drank beer and other fermented alcohol.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, we don't know how diluted this wine was, because if it wasn't diluted, they probably would have gotten really crunk. But but yeah, they became Frankish and French. These Norse Vikings from Norway became French. For our listeners, this assimilation is what's going to keep the Normans in power, not just in Normandy, but everywhere else they take over. All right, so now that was the Norman origins. I mean, there could be plenty more of that, but let's get to part 2. William the Bastard. The man. This is the illegitimate son of Robert of Normandy, Robert the Magnificent. So, Nick, you've studied William a good amount. What initial thoughts you have about this man in history?
This is a guy who, for all intents and purposes, should not be in the position that he's in. If anybody is familiar with any semblance of medieval power structure and medieval, what's the word I'm looking for when you're passing stuff on?
Succession.
He's called William the Bastard. Well, he does get another cooler title later, but we'll get to that. William the Bastard is because he's, as it says, he's a bastard. He's the illegitimate son of Robert the Magnificent. Robert was sleeping around, and one of those gave us William.
Very much like Liam Neeson and Orlando Bloom in Kingdom of Heaven. You know, the Baron of Evelyn, even though it's fictional. Balian never was a bastard son. But when Robert died, local Norman nobles tried to kill William. And there were so many plots hatched against him, and all of his caregivers got assassinated. This is a kid who is trying just to keep his head above water while one day trying to become the Duke of Normandy.
The problem is, as is always the case, when you hatch a plan where it's unifying messages, gaining power, and murdering children, you really can't trust those people. They start killing themselves off.
Yeah, there's a power vacuum. Pretty sure Robert and all of his Norman noble friends knew that William was a bastard, so they thought they had no claim to the throne as Duke of Normandy. But
he really doesn't, but whatever.
He really doesn't.
But, I mean, using the putting our historian hats on, like, illegitimacy was a big thing back then. Like, today, William would be just as a legitimate successor as someone else, that was born in that family. Like, but putting on our historians' caps,
illegitimacy,
huge thing in the Middle Ages.
Yeah, everybody had illegitimate children. If we ever talk about him, Henry VIII puts 2 illegitimate children on the throne at one point thanks to his succession plan.
Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. Like, how many wives he had to go through to get these kids? Like, that's, again, whole new episode for that. Tudors are interesting, but let's continue with the Normans. So William manages to escape the fray. The thing is, the local Norman nobles started killing each other too after all of this. So not only are they killing William, they're trying to kill everyone else in their bid for the throne. I mean, as good nobles would do to try to get the Duke position. William reappears at 20 years old. He escaped the fray, and he confronts his cousin Guy in open battle. So this is kind of the battle to which William will cement his place as the Duke of Normandy. He crushes his cousin Guy, and he assumes the title. William, the bastard, is now Duke of Normandy.
Never forget that monarchs and nobles are complete fucking idiots.
100%.
They could have found a way to make it all work, and all of them could have shared some level of power, but they couldn't do it, and they ended up killing each other, and the guy that they were trying to prevent from getting the power in the first place ends up getting the power anyway, so idiots.
Somehow,
Total comedy of errors.
Yeah. So William assumes his position as the Duke of Normandy. And so, first few things that he does, the Norman capital was at Rouen, but he moves it to Caen. C-A-E-N, not the Cannes, not in Cannes in the south of France, because the Cannes Film Festival is down there, but the Normans have not gone further south. So, Caen. So the capital is in Caen. Here's the thing. He creates more controversy for himself and marries his cousin Matilda.
Yeah.
That's good.
This
Not
is the
enough
moment.
controversy already.
Talk about later, post-Middle Ages. You know how monarchies are really intertwined? They keep the blood in the family and not bring outsiders in.
It's interesting to hear that European nobility at one point really had a problem with cousin fucking.
The Catholic Church didn't want people marrying cousins, no matter how distant they are. Not only is William a bastard, he's making a lot of problems for himself right now. It's just all right, I'm the illegitimate son, which is not his fault, but I'm also marrying my cousin Matilda. So guess what they do? They make 2 abbeys in Caen. One for men and one for women. So Abbé d'Auzon and Abbé d'Affam. As good Norman insurance policy goes, you make 2 religious sites. He puts his religious policy in place, kind of telling the church, I'm sorry, here's your 2 places of worship for men and women. And so that's what he does. So it's not starting well. He makes those 2 churches to make sure that, he's good. Him and the Pope, we good? We good. So now he has sites on another prize. But we have to talk about knights. In Norman times, they started using knights. Initially, they were kind of like thugs, the dregs of society, but later on they became known for positions of honor and courage, and they became part of the social hierarchy in France. And so by the time of William the Bastard, having a lot of knights meant that you were pretty much legitimate. When it came to these fiefdoms, so knights started controlling land. So I'm going back to fiefdoms right now. Knights started controlling land. But at one point, there were more knights in Normandy than land there was to be given out. Now we're starting to see expansion with the Normans. So, Nick, what prize does William have now in his sights?
He has one of the 3 most powerful kingdoms in Europe. That would be England. And I hope you guys are ready, because there's no better time to talk about the shit going down in England than on this weekend, WrestleMania weekend, because what we have here is a traditional WWE style drama plotline going on.
Yeah, we're talking about Edward the Confessor here. So Edward the Confessor was generally considered a good king.
One of the best of medieval England.
What were some of the things that he did that generally makes people look up to him?
So he had effective taxation, to where the country had a lot of money in store, and the currency was really strong. He centralized government.
He also helped rebuild Westminster Abbey.
But the thing is, he didn't have an heir.
Yeah, he died childless. Now, step aside, son. This is my shit.
Nick, take it away.
All right. So we got ourselves a good old-fashioned triple threat match. Edward the Confessor dies at 1066, but before we get to that, we need to set up the plot line here. According to William, Edward promised William the throne. And as a cousin to Edward, William has a legitimate claim to the throne. However, there is the Godwinsons, the richest family in England at the time. At this time, that family is headed by Harold. Harold has no legit bloodline claim to the throne, but he is the wealthiest man in England. As an Anglo-Saxon himself, the Anglo-Saxon nobility would be much more willing to hand over fealty to him than they would to William.
So there is a third character in this, and he, in my opinion, is one of the biggest bad men in the Middle Ages, Viking Harold Hardrada. So this guy has a story. It's like, have you seen the South Park episode with Russell Crowe fighting around the world?
Yes.
I haven't seen it.
He is literally Russell Crowe and fighting around the world. Like, he was the deposed king of Norway. He goes down to the Kievan Rus, starts doing good things for him, goes down to the Byzantine Empire, fights in the Varangian Guard, which we'll talk about in the next episode, and fights for the Byzantines, comes back up, reclaims his crown as king of Norway. But then a little bit of Godwinson betrayal right now. Tostig actually invites Harold to take the English crown. For all you Tottenham fans out there, this term bleeds my ears, and it bleeds out mine.
Suck it.
I mean, I don't know why. So, Harold Godwinson defeats Hardrada at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. He defeats him at Stamford Bridge, September 25th, 1066. Harold Hardrada dies in battle, so the Norwegians leave. Brought a big fleet, only 25 ships were needed after to carry the bodies, and there's remaining survivors. So Godwinson is on a high. But then, a few days later, he finds out that William is making his voyage across the channel to Hastings. And it's a pretty big fleet.
He's only bringing 7,000 men.
I mean, but that's a pretty big figure for the time.
That is a big figure, but the problem here is that the English can match that. No problem. They do have home field advantage. William can only bring so many across the channel. By the way, Harold at this point has had himself crowned king. Unrecognized yet. There's been no coronation, but he is assumed king at this point. He'll never fully get coronation because of the stupid thing he does next, which is decide to challenge William at the Battle of Hastings.
He could have literally just starved out William and blocked him out. And if he had a navy, which he didn't, he could have blocked out the exit for the Normans as well. He could have just kept him at Hastings and forced him to make terms, but he got arrogant.
Yeah, he had to fight. And look, it's not like the Battle of Hastings. It's not like he met William and like William just ran all over him. Actually, for a lot of the day for the battle, there was a chance that Harold could have overtaken William and put an end to this. However, it should be noted that William is one of the best generals of the Middle Ages, especially this time period. Whenever they were falling apart, he did manage to rally the troops. It also should be noted that William was received from the Pope the papal banner, which, especially to the very religious people of Europe at the time, that meant that William had God on his side.
And that was supreme legitimacy. Godwinson didn't have that. What's also really important about this is that the position of king is ordained by God in the most medieval sense. That if you're a king, you are ordained by God to lead where you were leading. And to have that papal banner from the Pope, that meant that you were legitimate. You were the successor to the king. You had to claim it to the throne.
So Godwinson takes an arrow to the eye and dies. With their leader dead, that means that, of course, William is the victor on the day.
It's also displayed in that Bayeux tapestry.
Yeah, you can say what you want about the Bayeux tapestry because it does heavily favor the Norman side of the story, but it does give us basically the full story of this whole event. But the point here is that William is unchallenged for his rule of king, and William the Bastard gives way to William the Conqueror.
So he gets the name change. He's no longer a bastard. Still is, but he is now the Conqueror.
And
Rank level up, baby.
He is crowned William the First of England at Westminster Abbey in front of the tomb of Edward the Confessor with Edward's crown to solidify his legitimacy.
Well, it's like him eating that Super Mario mushroom where it's like blam blam blam. You know, the mushroom level up. But the thing is also, I think going back to the Battle of Hastings, that the thing that separated William and Godwinson is that he had cavalry. The Anglo-Saxon army did not have cavalry. It initially wasn't effective because the Anglo-Saxons had such a good shield wall. But one part of the battle, the Normans started to, according to the sources, have a feigned retreat. But some other sources said that William actually died. But William had to show his face. to rally the men again. But the thing is, the Saxons broke and tried chasing him, so that shield wall broke down. So his cavalry became more and more effective. And then he got the arrow to the eye, but also, according to other sources, that there was actually a death squad sent to find Harold in battle and essentially mutilate him. So cut off his head, cut off his arms, and the final thing, which is a very medieval thing, cut off his genitals.
Oof.
I'm not sure why his crotch fruit was so so desired. That's for another time.
That's it for Harold as his footnote in history.
So William gets crowned King of England at Westminster Abbey with Edward the Confessor's crowd. In the crowd, there were Anglo-Saxon nobles. So he's the away team on home field getting crowned king.
And for what it's worth, William does try to work with the Anglo-Saxon nobles at first.
Yeah, but the thing is, the nobles outside thought there was disagreement going on, so they decided to burn every building around the abbey, and that just fractured the relationship with the Anglo-Saxon nobles.
Yeah, it's an important part of conquering. You learn this in any time a conqueror comes in and takes over the land, and has people don't recognize just how important the fact that somebody speaks a different language than you is in charge of you. It's important because at this point, there's no way to ignore the fact that the people in charge, or at least the one person in charge now, is different than you.
For me, what was fascinating is that when we talk about the Vikings assimilating in French culture when they get Normandy, it was very much the opposite in England. The high court only spoke French. The Anglo-Saxon peasantry didn't learn French. Or should I say, the Norman nobles didn't learn Anglo-Saxon. That's interesting, to me at least.
Now, obviously, as a conqueror and not Anglo-Saxon-born ruler of England, William still is met with resistance, especially up north, due to a long history of Danish invasions of England. Now, actually, at one point, the English kings were Danish themselves.
Yeah.
Like, England has a long history of, especially in the Middle Ages, of not having Anglo-Saxons in charge of the country. Hell, the modern royal family isn't of English descent.
Oh, really?
Nope, they're German.
Fun fact, most of the royal families in England were not necessarily full-blooded English. We'll see the Plantagenets after being French, the Hanovers, German, the Saxe-Coburg-Goethas around the Windsors, who are German. So it's a very foreign royalty-ness to England. And so we go back to the nobles in the north. So what William started to do in the south was the creation of castles for intimidation. So we're seeing what's going on in Normandy being transferred over to England. The Normans wanted to make sure the Saxons know who their overlords were. So the creation of castles were also used for intimidation in England. So going back to the nobility in the north. The nobility in the north was Danish because, again, the Danelaw. When we see with this Viking invasions earlier in the previous centuries, they want to resist William. William gets word of this. Nick, what happens?
We have ourselves an event called the Harrying of the North. Well, it starts off with the northern towns revolting and killing Norman garrisons. Again, these are conquerors. They view them as such, and they are revolting against who they view as conquerors. Of course, William is not happy that a garrison of his troops was killed, so he personally marches his troops from London up to the north and massacres whole towns. York, and there's two other ones that escape me at the moment.
Jeez.
York is the most important city up there.
Yeah. York's the most important city up there, and wipes out, the best estimate of it is 100,000 people.
And it's
geez.
And it's not just killing. He also burns the land to make sure no food is created.
When this is recorded in the Doomsday Book, much later, it still states in the Doomsday Book that a lot of this land is still ash.
So a lot of people in the north died of famine as well. A basic guesstimation is that 100,000 people died by getting killed by Normans or by famine. And William was actually quite remorseful for this after. I mean, because the thing is, the Normans became known for their piety. And William was not pious in this situation. And so I think that according to sources, that he was wanting to ask for forgiveness.
It's easier to ask for forgiveness than permission.
Yeah, king.
Big historical facts right there.
Yeah. So,
but I think it's important to note, though, that after this, the harrying of the North, the Normans don't run into any further resistance from the Anglo-Saxons. That's basically it at that point.
and we see the complete militarization of England after this.
Yeah.
England becomes a formidable power. But the thing is, with this militarization of England, there was forced labor by the Anglo-Saxons. So the Anglo-Saxons were forced to make these castles for the barons. So we talk about Anglo-Saxon nobility. Over time, they get replaced by the Normans. So Norman nobility takes over the country. We talk about the English language, right? We have multiple words for the same meaning, for the same thing. We see the modernization of the English language. We see the incorporation of French words. So we see French words like royal, law, and pork. They are French words. King, rule, and pig are Saxon. So we have the same word in different ways because of the French addition to the English lexicon. We start to see the creation of what we consider Chaucer English, even to the day. Like, we see so many words in the French language that are used in English.
Oh, yeah, I'm saying, like, this would be the modern, not the modern, but this would be the form of English that would really take hold in England until about the time of Shakespeare, when we start to associate more modern English.
Yeah, and because French was spoken in the high court by 1500, it was just the language you learned in class, French.
Is this part of why the English language is such a, like, Frankenstein language then? Because you have the Normans and you have other, like, Franks and, like, Germans taking different turns ruling and all that? Like, is that why English has such a cobbled together history?
Yeah.
Yeah, and because you have Anglo-Saxons and Jutes bringing Germanic words into the English language, you have the French bringing in their words, and so it's really, English is it's one of the oddest languages to learn. I mean, I feel bad for people trying to learn English because it's so off. It's such an off language. We see French now being incorporated in the English lexicon. There was for me, I found some funny tidbits about Norman England. I mean, most of it isn't funny because we talk about oppressors and the oppressed, and that's a big trope in history. But there was a thing called the 100. So the 100 was a fine. So if a man was found dead, the village had to prove that he was English. So if Normans found a dead body, they would find the nearest village and say, was this guy English or Norman? It was the village's responsibility to prove that he was English. If they couldn't prove it, he was assumed to be Norman. And so the village had to pay a huge fine. It's never specified on how much they had to pay. It could have been 100-something of the currency that they had. That would be funny.
So, David.
Yes.
You are the new ruler of a land you conquered, but you don't really know much about the land you just conquered. What do you think is the best way to go about this?
Well, if I were the ruler of a land I just conquered, I would talk to the people who I'd conquered, or at least those who will associate with me, and try to figure out how I can rule things in a way that will bring about a smooth transition so they don't come for me with a guillotine.
Now let's assume that you are the conqueror who speaks another language, has no interest in learning the local language, don't have time for that bullshit.
Okay, so you know everything I just said?
Yeah.
Still do that, except the exact opposite.
Okay, well, what William decides to do is to enact a major census of his holdings, basically the entirety of the English country, the island. He does this in 1086, about 20 years into his rule. Or at least it's finally published in 1086. I can't remember exactly. He starts it early, I know that.
It's officially completed in 1086, 1 year before his death.
And this is called the Doomsday Book. It has if you're a tiny farm with a cow, it's put on there. If you have a mill, it's there. Everything in there. And actually, a lot of the names for tiny towns and boroughs and such in England comes from the Doomsday Book because that's just how they associated it with.
Yeah, you see the name, it looks like the Domesday Book, but it's pronounced Doomsday. So if you see it and we say Doomsday, they're like, what the fuck? No, it's Doomsday. It's not Domesday. This is one of the most meticulous accruing of data for a country at the time. I mean, how many nobles live in a certain county? What's the population? How many cows are on a certain farm? How many mills are there in a county? Really, this is probably one of the most rigid Byzantine ways of collections of data in the Middle Ages. And this is what makes William an effective ruler at this sense.
Yeah, he's aware of everything. This also makes for much more effective taxing because you can know exactly what you're taxing for. It is basically akin to our modern census.
And
okay.
it also displays a wealth disparity, income inequality as well. So 20% of the total wealth of the country was for the king. 25% of the total wealth was to the church. 50% to the Norman baron. And then 5% was given to the rest of the population. So we see another historical trend.
Income inequality.
David, you are an expert on this. And we see it's nothing new here.
Yeah, it kind of like, I find any conversation about history interesting, but I feel like that meme from Django Unchained where it's like, gentlemen, before you had my curiosity, but now you have my attention.
However, all is not to be for William. Obviously, we don't live forever. And in 1087, William dies.
And it's kind of an interesting way how he died.
We're going to tell them how he dies, and I'm going to tell the aftermath because it's one of my favorite historical stories.
This will be good.
Like, this is like, for a conqueror, this guy just dies in the most unusual way. So as some humans who don't take care of themselves, William started to get fatter. And so he was riding, and there's an accident, and his saddle pierced his stomach. So he was rushed to a local house, a local chapel, I'm not sure where, but he rushes to attend his wounds, but then he dies, gets buried, and I think it was Abbe de Zolm. I think it was one of the cathedrals he made in Normandy. But for someone that big, the people who wanted to bury him got some dimensions wrong, and I feel like Nick has to talk about this. Yeah. This is one of history's like biggest like what the fuck moments, and it soured a whole ceremony.
If you were a royal, your sarcophagus was made well before your death, and it was dimensioned for how you were when they were building it. As Cameron stated, William got very fat in his later years, and when he died, they did not change the dimensions of his sarcophagus.
So this is almost like that rumor about Howard Taft and the White House bathtub, except actually true.
Yeah, so when he was being dropped into his tomb, he was too big for it, and they had to force him into it. However,
wait, sorry, I have a question real quick.
Yeah.
Was Yakety Sax playing in the background as they were trying to do so?
We could only hope.
Or the Benny Hill theme song.
I think I'm thinking of the same thing.
His body exploded.
Oh, geez.
His body exploded, and
Lord.
The stench filled the rooms. They couldn't cover it with anything. No incense, no anything, no herbs, no nothing. So they had to hurry the ceremony along, and it's a quick reminder, of course, that no matter how great you are in life, in death,
we're all just stinky bags of flesh.
Basically.
I can imagine the ceremony just plug in the nose like, in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Let's get the fuck out of here.
It should be noted that William is the first English king to be buried not in England. He's buried in northern France, as are his three sons, who will each become king of England at some point. This is the Norman Dynasty, which will rule for 87 years, if I remember correctly.
But then will be extended by blood for the Plantagenets all the way to the late 1400s. So England was very massive to say the least.
It's also important to note that because of this connection, it wouldn't be until I think John learned English but don't quote me on that one. But a lot of English kings after this would only speak French. They would never learn English until much later. The connection to William also provides every English monarch a claim to the French throne, which they would take up through into the 100 Years' War.
Because, fun fact, Henry VI was the only English king to be crowned King of France and King of England.
Yeah.
That must have been a mess.
The French changed the laws that stated that you could not claim the French throne if it was a claim through the mother. They did this specifically to prevent the English king from having the throne.
I remember when I was 13 or 14 years old, I was at Barnes & Noble, and I saw a book called That Sweet Enemy, and it was about love-hate relationship between England and France. I told my dad to get it. I got the book, and I realized the words were so small, and I just didn't read it. I can't do this. And I'm pretty sure the book is in my garage, but I haven't gotten around to reading it. And that was like 2007.
Ultimately, when it comes to the Normans, what's important to know here is that while their system of government would not last, their influence on England did. The language, the castles. We associate castles with England. That's a French thing brought by the Normans.
Yeah, and they still brought the Middle Age system of government, feudalism. And in 1066 is probably the greatest date in English history. That changed English society forever, and even that changed the fate of Western Europe forever.
That is the moment modern England is born.
Yeah, for our audience here, we are going to see a bigger thing. Is we talk about the Normans, we talk about William the Conqueror, we talk about the Battle of Hastings, we talk about the modern English language, we talk about Norman England. But the thing is, the Normans had the ambition of conquest and the ambition of expanding from Normandy. And in our next episode, they're going to have just as much of a legacy in southern Italy, Sicily, and the Middle East than in England. This is a testament to Norman ingenuity, Norman conquest, and their ability to assimilate into the local culture.
And for our loyal fans who are wondering where David disappeared to this episode, you'll get a lot more David in the next episode.
You will. David, thank you for being a trooper on this one. Your emphasis is Latin America. And, I mean, we could have talked about the Falklands if we wanted to talk about it. But thank you for all of our loyal listeners so far. Thank you for people who are actively involved in our social media pages. Thank you so much for reviews. Thank you so much for supporting us during this time. I'd like to give a special shout out to a few loyal fans who've been commenting on our pages. Ron Layton being one, Laurice Yadagarian, Michael O'Terre, Alex Millage, who made our cover photo. And it was a very big shout out to Alex, the creative mastermind, to making us look good aesthetically. Big ups to friends of the pod, Southpaw MMA podcast, Sam Yang. You're one of the real ones. Rhetorically speaking, thank you for the good review on iTunes. And so,
because she's standing right next to me, thank you to Caroline McDougall for making us sound
I was going to give her
as
a
good
shout out
as we could. I know that she had to get through a lot of us for that, a lot of footage for that, but thank you, Caroline.
Shout out to Caroline.
All right, ladies and gentlemen,
Buckle up.
fasten your seatbelts. Next episode, we will be talking about the Normans in the South.
Thanks, everyone.